Thank you for joining us. So this time of year, we start getting questions about uh, pruning on tomato plants. And so I thought I'd make a quick video to help us out with that question. And to begin with, we're going to start with a different term and defining it. So you may have heard of suckers on tomato plants. And what a sucker is depicted there on your screen in that picture. We have a branch or stem that forms at the junction of a leaf and the main stem. So there you see actually two suckers arising from either side of that main stem, right where those leaves are joined. And so those suckers are important when it comes to pruning because that's really a focus of our activity with pruning. And let me state up front, the suckers aren't a bad thing. It's a natural part of the tomato plant. It's basically how it grows larger, has multiple stems, so it's not a bad thing. But we do like to control that sucker growth for the best outcome for our tomato plants. So the good thing is those suckers, those small little shoots are very easily snapped out when small. If they are larger, you could use pruners, you might use scissors, certainly nothing wrong with that. But they are easily removed when small. The neat thing about it, if we do have some that get larger before we remove them, we can actually root those. So we can actually take those suckers, place them in moist potting media. So when we have a larger sucker, such as depicted here, where you have a length of maybe 3 to 4 inches and a couple of true leaves showing, we can actually root those and have a new tomato transplant. That's a clone of what we already have. So this is a great way to have a little bit later planting to help extend your harvest. And it can be a great way to save yourself having to start from seed again. So just placing those into moist potting soil. Tomatoes you may be familiar with root very easily. A couple of times during the year, I'll get questions from gardeners who have aerial roots forming on their plant, or maybe they have a stem in close contact with the soil and it's forming roots. This ability to produce roots easily along their stem, the adventitious roots, is actually why tomatoes can be planted deeper than they were originally growing in the pot as a transplant. Most other plants, almost universally, we don't do that because we want those roots at the same depth. But because tomatoes have the ability to quickly form those roots, we can plant them a little bit deeper in the garden. Don't go overboard with it. Don't get out the post hole diggers, but a little bit deeper is okay. I probably would not encourage you to root these in water, as you see depicted in the upper right-hand corner. You can do that, but I just think doing it in moist potting soil is perfectly acceptable and you'll have great results. And I think they'll get established quicker and easier for you. So the question we ask is, what type of tomato are you growing? And there's two broad categories. These would not include maybe some of the micro tomatoes, the dwarfs, things of that nature. I would probably say this talk doesn't address them, but by and large, there's two categories of tomatoes we see grown in the home garden. Those are indeterminate tomatoes and determinate tomatoes. So indeterminate tomatoes just keep growing until they die. They create a larger plant and they have their harvest spread over a longer period of time. And generally speaking, they offer a larger harvest. So if you're wanting to grow one tomato plant to have the maximum yield or harvest possible, you would be growing indeterminate tomatoes. These are most of our heirlooms, as well as a number of even our newer varieties. Determinate, or bush sometimes referred to, are tomatoes that reach a specific height and then stop growing. Might be 4 to 5 feet. Once they begin flowering, essentially they stop that vegetative growth and they go to reproductive or producing that fruit. They have overall a smaller plant, so it has a smaller yield. But because they are limiting their size and their flowering, they're actually concentrating when that harvest occurs. So lots of times determinate tomatoes are something that are good if you're looking at canning or otherwise preserving tomatoes, because you have more ready in a shorter period of time. So you actually have a concentrated harvest period. So that's a really good thing if you're looking at doing a period of canning or otherwise preserving and want to have plenty available to you. This is often seen with paste tomatoes. So those tomatoes that we often use for sauces and similar uses are very often determinate. There's also other bush tomatoes that are more modern cultivated varieties. And again, the big thing about them is they have that more concentrated harvest period and a generally smaller plant overall. But again, 4 to 5 feet, not a dwarf plant at all. So how do we prune the different types of plants? Well, first thing to understand with determinate, because they are basically self-limiting in size, we do not sucker them or remove those suckers. So we do very minimal pruning associated with them. With indeterminate, however, we do generally remove those suckers. We may do it 2 to 3 times, depending on the exact needs of your garden. And basically, it's about 2 weeks in between each pruning or suckering that we do. When do we start pruning on these plants? In truth, we can consider what we do really at the beginning of the season to be pruning. So if you are transplanting tomatoes into your garden, I'm going to tell you to prune off or remove any leaves that are directly in contact with the soil. You're going to also want to remove any damaged or broken leaves. It happens. It's not a big deal. The plant will keep growing, but certainly if you have broken leaves, it's not a bad thing to remove any bits that are hanging on or just not quite what they should be. It's all right to do that. The other thing I like to do, and I'm going to encourage you to do it as well, is remove any flowers or fruit that are present on those transplants at planting. The reason I like to remove those is if that plant is trying to establish and grow a larger plant at the same time it's trying to fill and grow those fruit, we've got limited resources going to both tasks. And so we won't have as large a fruit and we won't have as large of a plant. So I like to remove flowers or fruit that are there when I have a small transplant going into the garden and allow that plant to establish and focus on vegetative growth before it goes to reproductive growth, which is where we get that tomato fruit that we harvest. So I encourage you to remove those. If you don't, you actually will get an earlier harvest out of that plant, but I think it comes at the sacrifice of future harvests and yields out of the plant. So I like to delay it by a little bit, but get more from the plant in the end. The thing to understand with determinate, we're basically done with pruning. There's no major pruning that we do after this point. We could put an asterisk on that because I will mention one thing later, but by and large, we're done with determinate. However, indeterminate, we are a little bit different. So after we're done planting, once we get to where we do have flowering happening on that plant, what we will do is find the lowest or the first flower cluster. We will leave the first sucker immediately below it, and then we'll pinch out all the others that are lower. And we could have some coming up for the roots. We want to remove those as well. So you see that depicted there in the graphic. Again, we find our flower cluster. We leave one sucker intact below it, and then we remove all the others. So why are we doing this? The thing to understand about these suckers, they're not just an additional leaf. They're actually going to be another growing stem. So by leaving this one, we're going to have a second stem on this plant that will grow out, will produce tomatoes for us. So we are still getting additional growth out of this plant. So we'll have more than one growing stem. But by limiting it to just the one, we're allowing us to have better airflow. We're allowing for there to be a balance there, because if all of these were growing vegetatively, there's going to be less energy available for that fruit now that it's appropriate for us to be growing it. So again, limiting some of that vegetative growth and just saving one sucker immediately below that fruit cluster allows us to have a better plant overall. So one question you might ask, do we sucker these tomatoes all season long? Is it something where we keep going back without end? And the answer is no. So we will have suckers that arise on those growing stems later in the season. We pretty much leave those alone. And part of that is that those upper suckers up in the plant aren't a bad thing because they can help prevent things like sun scald. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. Basically, that leaf material is going to help shade the fruit that are below it. And so that's a good thing. We do come back 2 weeks after we do our first suckering because we can't have suckers regrowing from those same sites. And maybe depending on the vigor of the plant and what we're seeing happening, we may come back 2 weeks after that. So basically a month after that first initial sucker removal, we might come back a second time and do it again. Some of this kind of depends how close we are to harvest. The closer we are to harvest, the less picky we are about what's happening. So this is what sun scald looks like. And very often when we see it, it is like this. You have a tomato fruit that is very open to the sunlight. They aren't shaded in any way. So you think, well, that's a great way for them to get great color, but it can be an issue where there is too much sunlight. Essentially, they get burned or scalded. And so that's why we call it sun scald. Very often you will see this damage be actually colonized by a secondary, a decay organism. So it's white in this picture, but oftentimes we'll see something growing on it that makes it dark. It's just taking advantage of that dead material. What other pruning might we do? So there is some other pruning besides just suckering on these plants. If we have limited space in our garden, or if we're using trellising or caging, we can have indeterminate plants, the ones that keep growing all season, actually outgrow the space. And so here we have some steak tomatoes there you see in the back of the slide. We might actually top these plants or stop their growth, remove it, cut it out, prune out that extra growth to limit their size. Because if we have these plants growing larger than we can keep them staked up well, we're going to start having problems. They're going to start getting very thick. We have less sun and air penetration, which leads to more disease problems. Because really, that's a good reason why we're doing all our pruning. We're wanting to reduce conditions that make disease more likely. And so keep in mind that anytime we have wet leaves or fruit, we are enhancing the ability for disease to take control. And so by keeping things as airy as possible, allowing good sunlight penetration throughout the canopy of the plant reduces our threat of disease. Now understand, when we do top these plants, we're obviously sacrificing potential yield because we are removing the plant, any flowers that are present, or any additional flowers that might grow. So it is something where we're sacrificing yield, but we're maintaining the size that's appropriate for the area where we are growing them. Commercial growers who are growing indeterminate, particularly if they're growing like heirlooms, it's not uncommon at all. Once they reach the top of their trellising, they'll actually come in with like hedge clippers and actually just cut those back. And the reason is, if they don't, it can become so overgrown that's very difficult to get spray equipment in there to spray, or even pickers in there to pick the harvest. So it is something that is not uncommon in commercial production that is utilizing indeterminate plants. So again, what's great is it's easy to snap these out. So if we have these suckers, and here's a larger one, this would be a prime candidate for growing as a transplant. In this scenario here, we have a little bit different thing. So we probably wouldn't actually top these plants because we're growing in a greenhouse or a high tunnel. And looking at the system they have for trellising, it's a hanging system. And generally with these sorts of systems, we have the ability to move that hanger horizontally. So as those plants get taller, as they keep growing, we're able to move them horizontally. And so the stem isn't just going up and up, it's also going to the side now. And so we're able basically to lay the plant down the aisle in the greenhouse or the high tunnel. But what is important is we don't want too much growth. We don't want multiple leading stems coming off. And so we would definitely make sure that we do want to prune. So we can have some different scenarios on pruning depending exactly how we're trellising things, how we're growing things in our garden. But basically the same rules apply. We want to create a plant that's open, that's airy, and is not conducive to diseases. There are times when we have pruning that could occur even on determinate plants. So this is that asterisk that we could put in there. If we are utilizing particularly like a tomato cage and it's becoming very crowded, we are creating conditions that don't allow for good airflow or sunlight into that interior of the plant. And in those scenarios, then we would definitely look at pruning out some of those upper suckers or stems, because if that cage is overcrowded, we're creating conditions that are conducive to that disease potential. And because of that, we would miss out on yield. So while we are sacrificing some future yield by removing some of that growth, we're actually increasing the likelihood of getting a good yield because we're reducing the chance of disease. So there is a balance there, and it's not going to be something where every plant would require this, but in certain scenarios in the garden, we would be pruning even determinate tomatoes if they're becoming overcrowded in their caging. One thing I sometimes get questions about is, should I remove the lower leaves on tomatoes? We see this done commercially in greenhouse operations. Again, a little bit different scenario on what they're doing. But the reason folks want to do it is because we know that the soil splashing on lower leaves is a great way to get any number of different soil-borne diseases in our tomatoes. And so I would encourage you not to remove these preventatively. But if you are seeing disease symptoms on those leaves, it could be worthwhile to remove them. So do it reactively if you're seeing disease come in on those bottom leaves, and not just as a way of preventing it from happening. What I would tell you to do preventively is look at utilizing some mulch, such as organic mulches of any sort, straw, leaves, various other things could be used. And what they will do is prevent splashing of soil up on the bottom of those, on the bottom leaves of the tomato plant. And that can actually reduce the disease potential. So I wouldn't remove them preventatively. They do contribute to photosynthesis for the plant, but I would use mulching to try to prevent that disease conducive conditions from occurring. With that, let me ask you to like, subscribe, and click the bell to stay up to date on our future videos. If you haven't looked at our channel and checked out some of those videos, I think you might find them interesting. So thank you, and hope to see you watching again.